In the United States, President Trump has called on Republicans in the House of Representatives to vote in favour of the release of government files on the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. It is a reversal on his previous position, and it comes in a social media post in which Mr. Trump said that the debate about releasing the files was a Democratic Party hoax. He said the Republicans should vote to release them because, quote, "we have nothing to hide." While the shift in President Trump's position comes as dozens of Republicans have signalled they were willing to break ranks with the party on the issue. The House is expected to vote this week on legislation that would compel the US Justice Department to publicly release the Epstein files. Well, Donald Trump has consistently denied any wrongdoing in relation to the late Jeffrey Epstein. And speaking to reporters ahead of boarding Air Force One back to Washington, the president again blamed the Democrats.
So they're using Jeffrey Epstein as a deflection from the tremendous success that we're having as a party.
Hello and welcome. Every Dr. John is here. So what just happened? The release of 3 million pages of Jeffrey Epstein files is exposing a devastating gap between Trump's public claims and the documentary record of his relationship with Epstein. The evidence makes it increasingly impossible to maintain credible deniability, as the files fundamentally contradict the story Trump has told for years. Let me walk you through exactly what Trump has been saying publicly about Epstein, because the consistency of his public statements makes the documentary evidence all the more devastating. Trump's repeated, on-the-record public position has been that he barely knew Epstein, that they were not close, that he had not spoken to him in a very long time before his 2019 arrest, that he kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago when he found out about his behavior with underage girls.
And I've been talking to Nomia Iqbal for more on that U-turn from the president.
It's confusing, isn't it? But look, Ben, I think his U-turn now, his latest U-turn, is extraordinary. And I try not to use that word too much, given the nature of US politics these days. But he has spent the best part of a year, most of his presidency, downplaying these files, despite the fact that he campaigned, it was one of his big promises on the campaign trail to voters that he would release them. And also, in terms of this vote that is now going to happen tomorrow to release the files, he and the Republican leadership in Congress did a lot to try and block that vote from happening. And that is why I think it's extraordinary, because it's clear that he has lost his authority on this issue, that there has been this pressure by Congress for him to take this U-turn. And that in of itself is quite rare for Donald Trump to be under that sort of pressure. But I think it gives you a real sense of how toxic.
And that was the end of any relationship between them. That the whole thing was a media smear. That people were using a dead pedophile to attack him, and there was nothing there. No proximity, no knowledge, no cover-up. Nothing. He has said versions of that line in interviews, at press conferences, in social media posts, and in response to direct questions from journalists. And he has delivered it with the kind of flat, confident dismissiveness that was clearly designed to make the question feel silly, and anyone still asking it seem either misinformed or acting in bad faith. Move on. Nothing to see. I barely knew the guy. But here's the problem. The documents do not agree with that story. And now there are a lot of them, more than the White House was apparently prepared for. 3 million Epstein-related documents have been released by the Justice Department and by courts.
His association with Jeffrey Epstein has been how big an issue this whole issue of Jeffrey Epstein is for not just lawmakers, but also voters. On the issue of lawmakers, we've seen that astonishing fallout with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him on everything except for this. And I think also, Ben, the writing was on the wall. There's enough evidence to suggest that Republicans were planning to defy Donald Trump in standing with Democrats and calling for these files to be released.
And we talk about these files, Nomia. What exactly are they? Because we've had, we've seen thousands of emails that were released just the other day. But what's different about these files?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? Because as far as the public are concerned, they believe that there is a lot more to answer about Jeffrey Epstein. Now, these files that we've seen so far, I mean, some of them you can't really decipher. There's a lot of documents, there's screenshots, there's emails. People are looking for some sort of smoking gun. Now, this all goes back to the promises that Donald Trump made on the campaign trail, he and his MAGA base.
A volume of material that includes emails written by Epstein himself, flight manifests, guest lists, phone logs, estate records, and third-party correspondence spanning years of his operation, and Trump's name appears in those documents more than 1,000 times, 1,000 plus references across 3 million pages in multiple different categories of record, in different years, in different contexts. That is not a peripheral footnote. That is a sustained and documented presence in a world that Trump has publicly insisted he was barely part of. Among those documents are Epstein's own emails that have now been reported on by PBS NewsHour, the BBC.
Believe in this conspiracy theory, there's no evidence, that Jeffrey Epstein did not die by suicide, that he was in fact killed because he had this list, a list full of powerful people that had committed crimes, and that he was going to start talking. Now, there's no evidence of any of that, but the MAGA world have believed in that, and Donald Trump has stoked that a lot, and he did that on the campaign trail. And so I think what ultimately people want is a case of just release them all, just release all the files, everything that you have on it, all the investigations, and then people will go from there and see for themselves what is there. I think the fact that the public and lawmakers know that there are files that aren't out there, that are being kept under lock and key, I think that's the issue. And they just want all those files released. But as I say, that vote is due to happen tomorrow, and all the evidence so far suggests that it will pass, and then it will go onto Donald Trump's desk.
And CNN that describe Trump in terms that flatly contradict the public narrative. In a 2011 email, Epstein wrote that Trump has spent hours at his house and has somehow never been mentioned in press coverage of their relationship despite that closeness. And then there's the email from January 2019, the one that has drawn the most serious attention and created the most significant problems for the barely knew him story. In that email, Epstein, writing privately to author Michael Wolff, referenced Mar-a-Lago and stated that Trump knew about the girls and had asked Ghislaine Maxwell to stop bringing them. Trump knew about the girls. That is Epstein's language in Epstein's own private email to another person about Trump, specifically, directly, and explicitly contradicting the public claim that Trump had no knowledge of what Epstein was doing and no involvement in the world around him. Can you believe this? The man spent years telling everyone he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein. And Epstein's own emails say Trump knew about the girls and asked Maxwell to stop. Those two things cannot both be true. One of them is the documented record written by Epstein in real time in a private email he never expected to become public. The other is a public narrative constructed and maintained for years in the face of that record. And the documents are winning that contest in a way that is now genuinely difficult to explain away. But here's the part of this story that really tells you everything about the current moment. Because it is not just the documents and the emails and the 1,000+ references that make this story so significant right now. It is the reaction. It is what happened inside the Trump White House when these files started moving toward public release. The New York Times Magazine published a detailed investigation describing multiple Situation Room meetings. The Situation Room meetings where Trump's top advisors gathered specifically to plan for the release of the Epstein files and manage the political fallout. They feared devastating consequences from the emails and logs. They debated whether to push DOJ to slow walk or selectively withhold the Trump-related material. They prepared talking points that blamed Democrats for a smear campaign and lean heavily on the long-standing claim that Trump had once banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago. Emergency meetings in the Situation Room about a dead pedophile's emails, about damage control, about what the documents were going to show about the president, and what story to tell the public while it was being shown. That is a cover-up. Not a cover-up of a crime, necessarily, because no court has found Trump guilty of any Epstein-related conduct, and that needs to be said clearly. But a cover-up of the relationship, a cover-up of the knowledge, a cover-up of the decades-long social world they shared, and a cover-up that is now being blown apart in public page by page, email by email, reference by reference, as the documents keep coming and the story keeps getting harder to hold together. Let's start with Trump's shifting story, because the timeline of what he has said publicly about Epstein over the years is itself a major part of the story. In the 2000s, Trump was on the record calling Epstein a terrific guy. His words, and saying Epstein liked beautiful women on the younger side. That is a direct quote from Trump himself on tape from that era. They moved in the same social circles. They were photographed together. They attended the same events. Mar-a-Lago was part of their shared social world. They were, by every available piece of evidence from that period, genuine acquaintances operating in the same elite New York and Palm Beach network. Then Epstein was arrested in 2006 and pleaded guilty to state charges in 2008 as part of a deal that was widely criticized as far too lenient. A deal that then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta negotiated, who later served in Trump's cabinet. The relationship between Trump and Epstein got quieter publicly after that. And by the time Epstein was arrested again in 2019 and the full scale of his abuse network began to come into sharper public focus, Trump's public story had shifted into the version we have been hearing ever since. Barely knew him, had not spoken in years, kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago when he found out about his conduct. Nothing there. Smear campaign. The problem, the growing, documented, increasingly hard to ignore problem, is that the record does not match the revision. The 2011 Epstein email reported by PBS NewsHour and the BBC described Trump visiting Epstein's house and spending hours there, years after the period when Trump now claims the relationship had essentially ended. The January 2019 email to Michael Wolff, the one about Mar-a-Lago and Trump knowing about the girls and asking Maxwell to stop, is particularly significant because of what it implies about the nature and depth of what Trump reportedly observed or was told about. Trump knew about the girls. That is not a description of a casual acquaintance who knew nothing. That is a description of someone who was close enough to the operation to have specific knowledge about specific conduct and who, according to Epstein's own account, asked Maxwell to modify her behavior. That is awareness. That is proximity. That is the opposite of the public story. And then there are the 3 million documents. CNN reported that Trump's name appears more than 1,000 times across the Epstein document release in flight manifests, guest lists, emails, phone logs, and third-party correspondence spanning multiple years of Epstein's operation. 1,000 references. Now, and this is important to say clearly and fairly and completely, not every one of those 1,000 references implies wrongdoing. Many of them are likely contextual. The Epstein world was a specific elite social circuit, and Trump was part of that circuit. So his name appearing in records and correspondence from that world is not automatically evidence of criminal conduct. That needs to be said clearly. No court has found Trump guilty of anything connected to Epstein, and that remains the accurate and complete legal statement. But here is what 1,000 references in the documents does prove. It proves that the social and personal relationship between Trump and Epstein was substantially deeper and more continuous than barely knew him and had not spoken to him in years. 1,000 references across 3 million documents is not a peripheral acquaintance with no sustained connection. It is a person who was genuinely present in and connected to that world in a documented and ongoing way across multiple years. The scale of the record makes the public narrative impossible to maintain credibly. You cannot be a minor, tangential, barely there figure in someone's life and appear 1,000 times in their documents. Now let's talk about the White House freakout, because the Times Magazine piece is in some ways the most revealing and most important piece of this entire story. And I want to spend real time on it, because what it describes goes well beyond standard political damage control. The article draws on multiple sources who were inside or near those conversations, and it describes a White House in genuine crisis mode over the impending release of Epstein documents. Multiple Situation Room meetings, the actual Situation Room, the room where the country's most serious national security and crisis decisions are made, the room reserved for the highest stakes moments of any administration, in which Trump's senior advisors gathered specifically to plan for the file release and manage what they described internally as the threat of devastating political fallout. They were afraid of what was in those documents, afraid specifically of emails and logs that would show Trump's connections to Epstein more clearly and more directly than the barely knew him story could accommodate. The article describes advisors debating whether to push the Justice Department, which reports to the president, to slow walk the release of Trump-related material or to selectively withhold categories of documents that would be most damaging. And it describes the parallel preparation of coordinated public messaging, talking points designed to preemptively shape the narrative before ordinary people had the chance to read the documents themselves and form their own conclusions. The talking points leaned on the Mar-a-Lago ban claim. They framed everything as a Democratic smear campaign. They were designed to tell a story that made the documents seem less significant than they actually were before the documents were in anyone's hands. Think about what that means in full institutional terms. The president's senior team was meeting in the White House's most serious, deliberative space to plan how to manage court-ordered document releases about the president's connections to a convicted sex offender and debating whether the executive branch's control over DOJ could be leveraged to filter those releases. That is not political communications. That is the executive branch attempting to use its institutional power to control an accountability process that exists specifically to be independent of that power. And the fact that sources were willing to share the details of those conversations with the Times Magazine suggests that the discomfort inside those rooms was real enough that some people felt the need to put what they witnessed on the record. And here's the broader institutional question that BBC reporting, congressional investigators, and victims advocates have been raising consistently, and that I think is the most important long-term dimension of this entire story. How much of the Epstein record is still sealed and unavailable to the public? Who is making the decisions about what gets released and what stays redacted? And is the institution that is supposed to be making those decisions on behalf of the public, the Justice Department, actually operating independently in this case? Given that the president, whose political and reputational interests are most directly at stake in those decisions, is the same person who controls that institution and appoints the people who run it. BBC reporting and multiple victims' lawyers and members of Congress have all made the same fundamental point, that partial and selective releases of the Epstein files are themselves a form of cover-up because they create the appearance of transparency while allowing the most significant and most damaging material to remain hidden. Full accountability for what happened in that network for everyone involved at every level requires full disclosure. Not managed disclosure, not politically filtered disclosure. Full disclosure administered by institutions with no stake in the outcome. Let me lay out the timeline simply and clearly, because it helps to see the full picture of how Trump's story has evolved and how the documents have systematically undermined it. In the 2000s, Trump is on tape calling Epstein a terrific guy who likes women on the younger side. They move in the same circles. They share social spaces and events. Their relationship is documented in photographs and contemporaneous reporting. Then Epstein is arrested and convicted. Then Trump's public story shifts to, I barely knew him, had not spoken in years, kicked him out of Mar-a-Lago. Then 3 million documents come out, and Trump's name is in there over 1,000 times in flight logs, guest lists, emails, and phone records. And Epstein's own emails from 2011 describe Trump visiting his house and spending hours there. Then Epstein's 2019 email to Wolf says Trump knew about the girls and asked Maxwell to stop. Each new piece of documentary evidence is further from the barely knew him story than the piece before it. Each release makes the gap between the public narrative and the documentary record wider and harder to explain. And the only way to maintain the public narrative at this point is to claim that all of those documents are wrong. That Epstein was lying in his own private emails to other people. That 1,000 references in 3 million documents somehow mean nothing, and that every journalist and watchdog and congressional investigator looking at this material is either mistaken or lying. That is not a sustainable position. The documents exist. They have been released. They have been reported on by PBS NewsHour, CNN, the BBC, and the New York Times. They say what they say, and what they say is not consistent with the story that has been told publicly for years. The Situation Room meetings described in the Times Magazine piece are the most significant evidence of what this actually is. Not just a complicated relationship story, but an active, organized, institutionally resourced effort to manage and limit what the public learns about it. I want to be precise here because the language matters. The Times piece does not describe people in the White House being nervous about negative press coverage and writing some talking points to respond to it. That is normal. Every White House does that. What the piece describes is senior advisors meeting in the Situation Room, a space reserved for the country's most serious crises, to plan how to respond to the release of court-ordered documents about the president's connections to a convicted sex offender. It describes discussions about whether DOJ, which reports to the president, could be used to slow down or filter what got released. It describes coordinated, preemptive messaging designed to shape public understanding of the documents before people could form their own interpretations of them. That combination, the institutional space being used, the discussions about DOJ influence, the coordinated, preemptive narrative construction is what makes this different from ordinary political communications. This is the machinery of the executive branch being turned toward the goal of managing accountability, and the fact that we know about it, that sources inside or near those conversations spoke to the Times Magazine, suggests that not everyone inside the White House was entirely comfortable with what was being planned and executed. That discomfort expressed as source disclosure to journalists is itself a meaningful signal about how seriously those rooms understood what they were doing. The question of who is controlling what gets revealed is itself a major and deeply unresolved part of this story that demands continued attention. This is the piece that victims advocates and congressional investigators and BBC reporters keep returning to, and they are right to, because it matters enormously for any honest assessment of what accountability actually looks like here. The document releases that have happened so far are large. 3 million pages is a genuinely enormous volume of material, but they are not necessarily complete. There are still redactions throughout the released material. There are still sealed portions whose contents are not publicly known. There are still documents that have not been released and whose existence is known, but whose substance remains hidden behind court orders and administrative decisions. And the institution, with the most direct operational control over what gets released and what stays sealed, the Justice Department, is currently run by people who were appointed by and serve at the pleasure of the president, whose name appears in those same documents more than 1,000 times. That is a conflict of interest of the most direct and fundamental kind. The person most directly affected by the completeness of the Epstein disclosure has institutional control over the institution most responsible for the completeness of that disclosure. And the Situation Room meetings described in the Times Magazine piece provide documented source evidence that the people around that president were actively thinking about how to use that institutional position to manage and limit what the public learns about the contents of those files. That evidence of intent matters as much as the documents themselves, because it tells you that the filtering of information about this story is not just a theoretical possibility, but a documented pattern of behavior that was already being planned and executed in real time inside the White House. Until there is a genuinely independent review of what is still sealed, independent of the executive branch, independent of any institution that reports to someone with a direct stake in the outcome, the full truth about the Epstein network and everyone who moved through it remains subject to exactly the kind of managed, interest-driven filtering that makes people reasonably and logically skeptical that they are getting the complete picture. That skepticism is not conspiracy thinking. It is a rational response to documented facts about who controls what and what they have already been shown to be planning about it in private rooms in the White House. Think about what it means that the White House felt the need to hold Situation Room meetings about the Epstein files. These were not casual conversations in the West Wing. These were formal, structured meetings in the most secure and serious space in the executive branch. The Situation Room is where presidents and their teams gather to respond to terrorist attacks, to manage international crises, to make decisions about war and peace. And it was being used to plan the release strategy for documents about a dead sex offender and the president's connections to him. That tells you how seriously the administration took the threat posed by these documents. It tells you they understood that the documents were going to be damaging, that the barely knew him story was not going to hold up under scrutiny, and that they needed to deploy the full resources of the executive branch to manage the fallout. And now we are watching that strategy unfold in real time. The documents are being released, but they are being released in a controlled, staged manner. Some things come out, other things remain sealed. The public is getting pieces of the picture, but not necessarily the whole picture. And the person making the decisions about what stays sealed is the same person who most wants certain parts of the picture to remain hidden. That is not how accountability is supposed to work. That is not how transparency is supposed to work. And that is why the questions about what is still sealed are so important. Let me address the most important question directly. Does any of this mean Trump committed crimes related to Epstein? No. No court has found that. No charges have been filed. filed? The legal record on that question is clear. But what the documents do show is that Trump's public narrative about his relationship with Epstein is not accurate. He did not barely know him. He was not a peripheral figure in Epstein's world. He was present, documented, and according to Epstein's own private emails, aware of what Epstein was doing. That is a serious reputational problem for someone who has built his public identity around being a champion of law and order. The full picture of where we are right now is this. Trump has spent years publicly and repeatedly maintaining that he barely knew Jeffrey Epstein and had nothing relevant to hide about that relationship or that world. 3 million documents released by courts and the Justice Department say his name over 1,000 times in records spanning years of Epstein's operation. Epstein's own private emails from 2011 describe Trump spending hours at his house. Epstein's own private 2019 email to Michael Wolff says Trump knew about the girls and asked Maxwell to stop bringing them. The White House held emergency meetings in the actual Situation Room to plan how to manage the release of those documents and construct a public narrative that would protect the president before ordinary people could read the files and form their own views. And the Justice Department, which controls what is still sealed and what gets released, reports directly to the man whose name is all over the material it is deciding to disclose or withhold. That is the full picture, not a smoking gun of criminal charges against Trump, because no court has found that, and that remains the accurate and complete statement of the legal record, but a documented and expanding pattern of contact, awareness, attempted narrative control, and institutional management that makes the barely knew him public story completely impossible to take seriously as an accurate representation of the relationship. The documents keep coming out. The story keeps getting harder to contain with every new batch. And the gap between what Trump says happened and what the record shows happened keeps getting wider with every release. Whatever is still sealed, and we know based on the Situation Room evidence that decisions are being made by people with a direct interest in the outcome, the full truth is still not fully told. And that is the most troubling dimension of this entire story. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what documents are still being withheld. We don't know what redactions have been made and why. We don't know if the most damaging material is still hidden behind court orders and administrative decisions. And the institution that could answer those questions is the same institution that is being run by people who serve at the pleasure of the person most invested in keeping those answers hidden. That is not a healthy situation for accountability. That is not a healthy situation for transparency. And that is not a healthy situation for democracy. The Epstein files represent a test of whether our institutions can operate independently of political pressure, whether the truth can emerge even when powerful people want it to stay hidden. And so far, the evidence suggests that the answer to that question is uncertain. The White House has already shown that it is willing to use its institutional power to manage and limit what the public learns. The Justice Department has shown that it is willing to release documents in a controlled, staged manner that leaves many questions unanswered. And the president has shown that he is willing to maintain a public narrative that the documents directly contradict. The story is not over. The documents are still coming out. The investigations are still ongoing. The questions are still being asked, and the gap between the public narrative and the documentary record is still growing. What the next batch of documents will show, what the next revelation will reveal, what the next whistleblower will disclose, we don't yet know. But we do know that the pattern is clear. Trump's connections to Epstein were deeper and more sustained than he has admitted. The White House has attempted to manage and limit what the public learns about those connections. And the institutional mechanisms that should be providing transparency and accountability are operating under the control of people with a direct stake in the outcome. That is the full picture of where we are right now. The documents are winning, the cover-up is being blown apart, and the truth, whatever it ultimately turns out to be, is still emerging, page by page, email by email, reference by reference. We will be watching closely to see what comes next.